Hi, it's Scott Vogel on sex addiction, and I'm going to talk about what is an addiction to fantasy sex. Fantasy plays a very important role in a normal, healthy sex life. When the fantasy takes on a much larger role and becomes detrimental to a person's sex life, and their life in general, that's when it becomes a sexual addiction. You see, the brain is the real seat of sexual arousal and sexual satisfaction as well. Having a sexual imagination is a good thing. However, in the brain of a sex addict, the fantasy part of the equation usually takes on a disproportionately larger role, and it becomes harmful and detrimental not only to the person's sex life, but possibly to their overall life in general. So, when are fantasies unhealthy? Many sexual fantasies can be met through role playing. So, it's a common way for this form of sex addiction to manifest itself with a person who's predisposed to a sex addiction. A sex addict may start by asking his or her partner to play a certain role when they engage in sex. That's healthy. It could be anything from responding to a different name to stimulate them as being a stranger, or something more elaborate involving outfits and stage scenarios. This behavior can be fun and the key to a long sexual relationship. However, a sex addict turns this fantasy into an obsession. They think about it all the time, and their spare time is spent planning. Okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to do it? And then the purpose of sex changes. It's no longer about intimacy and love. It becomes the quest of satisfying their fantasies and not about using the fantasies for the overall satisfaction. So, what are the types of fantasy sex? Well, role playing, of course, is the first one. And when it's healthy role playing, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It becomes unhealthy when it takes over the entire role, when it takes over the entire person, and they start to use coercion to get what they want. They start to demand the fantasy sex, and they start to become much more aggressive, and it becomes uncomfortable to the partner. That's a big key to that. So, when does it become an addiction? Addictive behavior is when a behavior continues despite negative consequences. Earlier we said that fantasy can become an obsession, and this is where it affects the sex addict directly. When they think about the fantasy, that can be a distraction, and then it starts to hamper their professional social life by diverting their attention away from what they need to be concentrating on, and it starts to develop these specific patterns. The obsession takes over when all they can think about is their fantasy world. And then it starts to affect other areas of their life, like their social, their physical, their workplace, their spirituality, their exercise, because the fantasy starts to dominate the entire life. And they can't enjoy other types of sex anymore because it's all about the fantasy. And of course, what makes it an addiction? It becomes an addiction when the individual can't stop. That's one of the definitions of addiction, is the person can't stop. So, when is it unhealthy? It's unhealthy when it takes over the life. The fantasy sex is about role playing, it's about dressing, it's about creating scenarios, and it becomes an addiction when it starts to consume the person's life, when they can't stop and they want to stop. And forming new relationships for a sex fantasy sex addict is difficult because their core motive is how to live out the fantasy and using a person for sex. And while there's many avenues for meeting consenting adults who will engage in fantasy sex acts, the relationship is based on very narrow aspects of healthy relationship, and they're not likely to succeed in this relationship or make either party truly happy in the long term. And it could lead to the sex addict developing a very distorted view of what a healthy relationship is when they allow this form of fantasy sex to rule their lives. Please visit our YouTube channel on sex addiction for more videos on sex addiction and recovery from sex addiction. You can also visit our blog at onsexaddiction.com, where you'll find a free video explaining what sex addiction is, the 7 symptoms of sex addiction, the 4 traumas that lead to sex addiction, and the 4 faulty core beliefs that are set up by those 4 traumas of sex addiction. You'll also find the solution to recovery from sex addiction, the 7 paths success. This is Scott Vogel on sex addiction.